Mama can't walk anymore. The sun had no mercy that day, white and brutal, pressing down on the Wyoming plain like a hand determined to break whatever it touched. Hannah Moore collapsed to her knees on the dusty road, her injured leg finally surrendering to pain in miles. Her 6-year-old son Luke stood beside her, small hands gripping her coat, eyes too old for his years. The nearest town shimmered miles ahead, a cruel mirage. The farm behind them had turned them away. And now, kneeling in the dirt with the heat stealing her breath, Hannah understood what it meant to be truly alone. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far Hannah and Luke's story travels. And if this story touches your heart, hit that like button and stay until the end. You won't regret it. The summer of 1872 came to Wyoming Territory with the kind of heat that didn't ask permission. It arrived in late June and settled in like an unwelcome relative, determined to stay until it had taken everything worth having. The grass turned brittle. Creeks that had run clear in spring became threads of brown water, then dust. Cattle stood motionless in whatever shade they could find, and even the hawks seemed too tired to hunt. Hannah Moore had been walking for 2 days. Her son Luke walked beside her, his hand tucked into hers, his feet raising small clouds of dust with every step. He was 6 years old and thin as a fence post, with his father's dark hair and his mother's gray eyes, eyes that had learned far too early to watch the horizon for danger. They'd left Cheyenne on foot because they had no choice. The stagecoach cost more than Hannah had, and the wagon trains heading west didn't take on single women with children, not anymore. Too much risk, the wagon master had said, too much liability. So Hannah had wrapped what little they owned in a blanket, tied it across her back, and started walking north toward her sister's homestead near Buffalo. 80 miles, maybe 90. She'd lost count. The first day hadn't been so bad. They'd found water at a creek crossing and slept under a cottonwood that offered decent shade. Luke had been brave, asking few questions, eating his share of the bread and dried meat without complaint. He was used to hunger by now. They both were. The second day, Hannah's knee started to swell. It was an old injury, one she'd gotten falling from a horse 3 years ago, back when her husband Thomas was still alive, and they'd had horses to fall from. It ached in cold weather and stiffened after long walks, but she'd always been able to push through it, until now. By noon on the second day, each step sent sharp pain shooting up her thigh. By mid-afternoon, her leg had begun to drag. And by evening, when they reached the turnoff toward a small farm she'd been counting on for water and a night's shelter, she was limping so badly that Luke had taken to walking ahead, as if pulling her forward with his presence alone. The farm was a sorry-looking place, a sagging cabin, a barn missing half its roof, a few scrawny chickens scratching in the yard. But there was a well, and Hannah could smell bread baking, and that was enough. She knocked on the door and waited, her weight shifted onto her good leg, her hand resting on Luke's shoulder. The woman who answered was gray-haired and hard-eyed, with flour on her apron and suspicion in every line of her face. "Help you?" she asked, not unkindly, but not warmly either. "I'm sorry to trouble you, ma'am," Hannah said, keeping her voice steady despite the pain. "My son and I are traveling north to Buffalo. I was hoping we might fill our canteens from your well and perhaps rest in your barn tonight. We won't be any trouble." The woman looked her over, took in the worn dress, the dusty boots, the way Hannah was favoring her right leg. Then she looked down at Luke, who met her gaze without flinching. "You got money?" the woman asked. Hannah hesitated. She had a little, enough for food if they were careful, enough for emergencies, but not enough to spend on something as basic as water. "A little," she admitted. The woman shook her head. "Can't help you then. My husband's got strict rules about strangers. You want water? There's a creek about 3 miles east. You want shelter? There's a town 10 miles north." "Ma'am, please," Hannah started, but the woman was already closing the door. "I'm sorry," she said, and maybe she meant it, "but we got our own troubles." The door clicked shut. The lock turned. Hannah stood there for a long moment, staring at the peeling paint, feeling the last of her strength drain away like water through sand. Luke tugged on her hand. "Mama," he whispered. She looked down at him, at his small, serious face, at the way he was trying so hard to be brave, and something inside her cracked. "We'll keep walking," she said, forcing brightness into her voice. "The town's not far." But it was far. 10 miles might as well have been 100. They made it another mile before Hannah's leg gave out completely. It happened without warning. One moment she was walking, gritting her teeth against the pain, and the next moment her knee buckled and she went down hard, catching herself on her hands, the bundle sliding off her back and hitting the ground with a dusty thump. "Mama!" Luke dropped to his knees beside her, his hands on her arms, his voice high and scared. "I'm all right," Hannah gasped, but she wasn't. She tried to stand and couldn't. The pain was blinding now, radiating from her knee in waves that made her stomach turn. She could feel the joint swelling, hot and tight beneath her skirt. She looked around desperately. The road stretched empty in both directions. Nothing but sagebrush and heat shimmer and endless sky. The sun was lower now, but still brutal, still merciless. They had maybe 2 hours of daylight left. Luke was watching her with those two old eyes, waiting for her to fix this, to make it right the way mothers were supposed to. And Hannah wanted to. She wanted to stand up and brush herself off and keep walking until they reached safety. But her body had other ideas. "Mama, can you walk?" Luke asked, and there was something in his voice, not quite panic, but close. Hannah tried again. She got her good leg under her, pushed up with her arms, and managed to rise to a crouch before the pain knocked her back down. She bit her lip hard enough to taste blood, willing herself not to cry, not to scare Luke any more than he already was. "I need to rest," she said finally. "Just for a little while." Luke nodded. He picked up her bundle and dragged it over to a patch of sagebrush that offered a few inches of shade. Then he helped her crawl to it, actually helped her, his small hand supporting her elbow, his shoulder bracing her weight. When she was settled, he sat down next to her and opened their canteen. There wasn't much left, maybe a cup of warm, metallic-tasting water. He offered it to her first. "You drink," Hannah said. "You first," Luke insisted, and there was something in his voice that reminded her so much of Thomas that her throat closed up. She took a small sip and handed it back. Luke drank the rest without comment. The sun crawled lower. The heat didn't ease. Hannah dozed fitfully, waking every few minutes to pain or thirst, or the sound of Luke shifting beside her. He was being so quiet, so good. He deserved better than this. Better than a mother who couldn't even walk. Better than a life measured in miles and hunger. When she woke fully, the sky had turned gold and the shadows were long. Luke was standing a few feet away, one hand shading his eyes, looking down the road toward the south. "What is it?" Hannah asked, her voice hoarse. "I thought I heard something," Luke said. Hannah listened. At first she heard nothing but the wind in the sagebrush and the distant cry of a hawk. Then, faintly, she heard it too, the slow, steady rhythm of hoofbeats. Her heart jumped. She tried to stand again and managed, barely, to get to her feet using the sagebrush for support. Her legs screamed in protest, but she ignored it. She couldn't afford to look helpless. Not out here, not with her son. The rider came into view slowly, emerging from the heat shimmer like a figure from a dream. He was alone, riding a big bay horse, his hat pulled low against the sun. As he drew closer, Hannah could make out more details. Broad shoulders, worn leather vest, the easy way he sat his saddle. He slowed when he saw them, then stopped, about 20 feet away. For a long moment, nobody moved. Hannah stood there, swaying slightly, one hand on Luke's shoulder. The rider sat his horse, studying them with an expression she couldn't read. Then he dismounted in one smooth motion and walked toward them, leading his horse. "You folks all right?" he asked, and his voice was deep and quiet, the kind of voice that didn't waste words. Hannah opened her mouth to say yes, they were fine, just resting. But Luke spoke first. "Mama can't walk anymore," he said, and his voice was steady but small. "Her leg hurts too bad." The rider's eyes shifted to Hannah, and she saw him take in the way she was standing, all her weight on one leg, her face pale beneath the dust and sunburn. "How long you been out here?" he asked. 2 days, Hannah said. "We're heading to Buffalo. My sister has a homestead there." The rider glanced down the road north, then back at her. "Buffalo's 40 miles from here," he said. "Maybe more." Hannah's heart sank, though she tried not to show it. 40 miles. She thought they were closer. We'll make it, she said, lifting her chin. The rider didn't argue. He just tied his horse to a sagebrush and walked over to her, moving slow and deliberate, like he was approaching a spooked animal. Let me see your leg, he said. Hannah stiffened. I'm fine. No, you're not. He crouched down in front of her, not touching, just looking. Your knee's swollen. I can see it through your skirt. If you keep walking on it, you'll do permanent damage. Might not walk right ever again. Hannah stared down at him. He had gray eyes, pale and clear, like creek water. There was no judgment in them, no pity, just a kind of practical concern, the way a man might look at an injured horse. I don't have much choice, she said quietly. The rider stood up. He looked at Luke, then at the empty road, then back at Hannah. I got a cabin about 3 miles south, he said. You can rest there. Get that leg looked at properly. Then we'll figure out how to get you to Buffalo. Hannah hesitated. Every instinct she had screamed caution. She didn't know this man, didn't know his intentions. The world had taught her again and again that kindness came with a price. But her leg was on fire, and the sun was setting, and Luke was looking up at her with hope in his eyes. Why? She asked. Why would you help us? The rider considered the question. Because you need help, he said finally. And I got space. It was the simplest answer in the world. And somehow standing there in the failing light with her son's hand in hers and 40 impossible miles stretching ahead, it was enough. All right, Hannah said. The rider nodded. He walked over to his horse and returned with a canteen, which he handed to Luke. Drink, he said. Luke looked to his mother. Hannah nodded. The boy drank deeply, water running down his chin. Then the rider turned to Hannah. I'm going to pick you up now, he said. You can argue, or you can let me. But either way, you're not walking on that leg. Hannah wanted to argue. She wanted to insist she could manage. But when she met his eyes, she saw something that stopped her. A quiet determination that told her arguing would be pointless. What's your name? She asked instead. Caleb Reed, he said. Hannah Moore. This is my son Luke. Caleb nodded to the boy. Then, before Hannah could brace herself, he stepped forward and lifted her into his arms like she weighed nothing at all. Hannah gasped, partly from surprise, partly from the sudden relief of weight off her injured leg. She wanted to protest, to insist this was improper, but the words died in her throat. She was too tired, too hurt, too grateful. Caleb carried her to his horse and settled her sideways in the saddle. Then he picked up Luke and set him in front of her, so the boy was cradled between her arms. Hold on to the saddle horn, Caleb told Luke, and hold on to your mama. Luke nodded solemnly. Caleb retrieved Hannah's bundle, tied it to his saddle, and took the horse's reins. Then he started walking south, leading them through the cooling evening air. Hannah held Luke close and tried not to think about what she was doing. Trusting a stranger, riding toward an unknown destination, putting her child's life in the hands of a man whose face she couldn't even see beneath his hat. But what choice did she have? The sun touched the horizon, spilling red and gold across the sky. The heat began, finally, to ease, and somewhere ahead, hidden in the sagebrush and shadow, Caleb Reed's cabin waited. They walked for the better part of an hour, and Caleb didn't speak except to tell Luke the names of birds when the boy asked. Meadowlark, mourning dove, nighthawk. His voice remained low and even, a steady current beneath the sounds of hooves and creaking leather. Hannah watched the back of his head, trying to get a measure of him. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with dark hair that needed cutting and shoulders that spoke of years of hard work. His clothes were worn but clean, his boots scuffed but well maintained. Everything about him suggested a man who lived simply and took care of what was his. But that told her nothing about his character, nothing about whether she and Luke would be safe. As if sensing her thoughts, Caleb glanced back over his shoulder. There's a widow woman lives about a mile from my place, he said. Mrs. Hollis. I'll send word to her tonight. She can come sit with you if it makes you more comfortable. Hannah felt something loosen in her chest. Thank you, she said quietly. Caleb just nodded and kept walking. When the cabin finally came into view, Hannah's first thought was that it looked solid. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by cottonwoods, with a good roof, a stone chimney, and a small barn off to one side. There was a garden plot, mostly dried up in the heat, and a well with a bucket hanging from the crossbar. Caleb led the horse right up to the porch and stopped. He tied the reins to the rail, then reached up and lifted Luke down first. The boy landed on his feet and immediately turned back, watching as Caleb carefully lifted Hannah from the saddle. This time Hannah was ready for it. The startling strength, the gentleness. Caleb carried her up the porch steps and into the cabin, where he set her down on a low bed in the corner. The cabin was one large room, neat and spare. There was a table, 2 chairs, a fireplace, a few shelves holding supplies. Everything had its place. Nothing was wasted. Caleb moved to the fireplace and began building a fire, though the evening was still warm. For light, he explained, catching Hannah's look, and to heat water. He worked quickly and efficiently, and within minutes a small fire was crackling in the hearth. He hung a kettle over the flames, then turned to Luke. "You know how to work a pump?" he asked. Luke nodded. "Good. There's a bucket by the door. Go fill it from the well. Your mama's going to need to soak that leg." Luke looked to Hannah, who nodded. The boy grabbed the bucket and headed outside, his small frame silhouetted briefly in the doorway before disappearing into the dusk. Caleb pulled one of the chairs over to the bed and sat down. He didn't ask permission before reaching for Hannah's leg, just gently pushed her skirt up past her knee and began unlacing her boot. Hannah stiffened. "I can do that." "Can you?" Caleb asked mildly, not stopping. Hannah realized she probably couldn't, not without bending her leg, which would send fresh spikes of pain through the joint. So she bit her lip and let him work. The boot came off slowly, carefully. Then Caleb peeled down her stocking, and Hannah couldn't suppress a small gasp. Her knee was twice its normal size, the skin tight and angry-looking, already darkening with bruises. Caleb examined it without touching, his expression unreadable. "You do this falling?" he asked. "Old injury," Hannah said. "I've been walking on it too long." "Yeah," Caleb said. "You have." Luke returned with the bucket, water sloshing over the sides. Caleb took it from him and set it by the fire to warm, then added a handful of something from a jar on the shelf. Salt, Hannah realized. While the water heated, Caleb rummaged through a chest near the bed and came up with a length of clean cloth. He tore it into strips without comment, his movements practiced and sure. "You do this often?" Hannah asked, watching him. "Patch up strangers?" Caleb glanced at her. "I do what needs doing," he said. "Same as anyone." But it wasn't the same as anyone, and they both knew it. Most men would have ridden past without stopping. Most men wouldn't have offered their home, their supplies, their time. When the water was warm, Caleb brought the bucket over and set it at the foot of the bed. Then he helped Hannah shift so her leg was hanging over the edge, her swollen knees submerged in the salt water. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. Hannah closed her eyes and let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. "Leave it in there as long as you can stand," Caleb said. 20 minutes if possible. It'll help with the swelling." He stood and moved to the shelves, where he began pulling down supplies, cornmeal, bacon, a tin of beans. "You folks hungry?" he asked. Luke, who had been standing quietly by the door, perked up. "Yes, sir," he said. Caleb nodded and set to work. He moved around the small kitchen with the ease of long practice, measuring cornmeal, slicing bacon, stoking the fire. Within minutes, the cabin filled with the smell of food cooking, and Hannah's stomach clenched with sudden, desperate hunger. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten a real meal, couldn't remember the last time someone had cooked for her. Luke drifted over to the table and climbed into one of the chairs, watching Caleb with solemn interest. "Are you a cowboy?" he asked. Caleb smiled, just a small quirk at the corner of his mouth. "Something like that," he said. "My pa was a cowboy," Luke said, "before he died." Caleb's hands stilled for just a moment. Then he continued stirring the cornmeal. "What happened to him?" he asked quietly. Hannah tensed, but Luke answered without hesitation. "He got sick," the boy said. "Fever. Mama tried to make him better, but he died anyway." "I'm sorry," Caleb said, and something in his voice made Hannah believe he meant it. Luke shrugged, a gesture too old for his years. "It's been a long time," he said. But it hadn't been. Not really. Thomas had died less than a year ago, and some days it still felt like yesterday. The sound of his breathing growing labored, the heat of his skin, the way his hand had gone slack in hers. Hannah pulled her thoughts back to the present and found Caleb watching her. Their eyes met across the small room, and for a moment something passed between them. An understanding, maybe, or a recognition. They'd both known loss. Both knew what it meant to keep moving forward when forward was the only direction left. Then Caleb turned back to the stove, and the moment passed. Dinner was simple but good: cornbread and bacon and beans flavored with salt pork. Luke ate like he was starving, which he probably was. Hannah ate more slowly, savoring each bite, trying not to think about how long it had been since she'd tasted anything this good. Caleb ate standing up, leaning against the counter, his plate balanced in one hand. He didn't talk much, but he listened when Luke chattered about the road, the heat, the hawk they'd seen circling overhead. When the meal was done, Caleb washed the dishes while Hannah soaked her leg. Then he helped her move to the table, where he rewrapped her knee with the clean cloth, binding it firmly but not too tight. "Keep it elevated when you can," he said, "and stay off it for at least a few days." "I can't," Hannah started, but Caleb cut her off. "You can," he said, "because if you don't, you'll cripple yourself. And then what use will you be to your boy?" It was harsh, but it was true. Hannah closed her mouth. Caleb stood. "I'm going to ride over to Mrs. Hollis's place," he said. "Let her know you're here. I'll be back in an hour or so." Hannah nodded, too tired to argue. After he left, the cabin felt very quiet. Luke climbed onto the bed and curled up against her side, his small body warm and solid. Hannah put her arm around him and stared into the fire, watching the flames dance and shift. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, didn't know how long they'd be here, or how they'd get to Buffalo, or what would happen when they did. But for now, they were safe. They were fed. And that, Hannah thought, pressing a kiss to Luke's hair, was more than they'd had in a long time. Outside, the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, leaving only the crackle of the fire and Luke's steady breathing against her side. Hannah closed her eyes, letting exhaustion wash over her in waves, but sleep wouldn't come. Her mind kept circling back to the same questions. Who was this man who'd taken them in, and what did he want in return? Nothing came free in this world. She'd learned that lesson the hard way. Luke stirred against her, his voice drowsy. "Mama, are we staying here?" "Just for a little while," Hannah whispered, "until my leg heals." "I like it here," Luke murmured, already half asleep. "It's quiet." Hannah stroked his hair and said nothing. Quiet could be good or dangerous, depending on what hid beneath it. She must have dozed, because the next thing she knew, the door was opening and Caleb was stepping inside, bringing with him the smell of night air and sage. He moved quietly, banking the fire and setting his hat on a peg by the door. "Mrs. Hollis will come by in the morning," he said without preamble. "She'll bring some things for the boy, clothes if she's got any that'll fit." "You didn't have to do that," Hannah said. Caleb shrugged. "She offered." He pulled a blanket from the chest and spread it on the floor near the fireplace. "You and the boy take the bed. I'll sleep here." "This is your home," Hannah protested. "We can't." "You can, and you will," Caleb said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He settled onto the blanket with his back to the wall, his rifle within easy reach. "Get some sleep, Mrs. Moore. Morning comes early." Hannah wanted to argue further, but the firmness in his voice stopped her. Instead, she adjusted Luke on the bed and pulled the thin quilt over them both. The bed smelled like wood smoke and soap, clean and simple, and despite everything, she felt herself relaxing into it. "Mr. Reed," she said quietly into the darkness. "Yeah?" "Thank you." There was a long pause, then, "You're welcome." Hannah closed her eyes and finally slept. She woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Luke's voice, bright with excitement. Sunlight streamed through the windows, gentler than yesterday's brutal glare, and for a moment Hannah couldn't remember where she was. Then it all came back, the road, the pain, the stranger on horseback. She sat up carefully, testing her leg. The swelling had gone down some overnight, though the knee was still tender and stiff. She could bend it a little without the blinding pain of yesterday, which felt like a small miracle. Luke was sitting at the table with Caleb, watching the man pour coffee into 2 tin cups. Caleb glanced over when he heard her move. "Morning," he said. "How's the leg?" "Better," Hannah admitted. "Good." He filled a third cup and brought it to her. "Mrs. Hollis will be here soon. She's bringing breakfast." As if summoned by his words, there was a knock at the door. Caleb opened it to reveal a woman in her 50s, round and practical-looking, with sharp blue eyes and a basket over her arm. "Caleb Reed, you didn't tell me she was pretty," Mrs. Hollis announced, sweeping into the cabin. She set her basket on the table and turned to study Hannah with frank curiosity. "No wonder you brought her home." "She needed help," Caleb said evenly. "That's all." "Mm-hmm." Mrs. Hollis didn't sound convinced, but she smiled at Hannah. "I'm Martha Hollis. I've got a homestead about a mile east. Caleb here is my nearest neighbor, though he's not much for socializing." "Hannah Moore," Hannah said. "And this is my son, Luke." Martha's eyes softened when she looked at the boy. "Well, aren't you a handsome young man? I brought some things that might fit you." She pulled a bundle from her basket, a pair of trousers, a shirt, both worn but clean. "My grandson outgrew these last year. No sense in them going to waste." Luke looked to Hannah, who nodded. "What do you say, Luke?" "Thank you, ma'am," Luke said politely. Martha beamed. "Good manners. I like that." She turned back to Hannah. "Now, let's have a look at that leg Caleb's been fretting about." "I haven't been fretting," Caleb said mildly, but he stepped back to give Martha room. Martha examined Hannah's knee with practiced efficiency, her hands gentle but thorough. "You did a number on this," she observed, "but Caleb wrapped it well. Keep doing what he told you. Rest, elevation, salt soaks. Give it a week and you should be able to walk again. Won't be comfortable, but you'll manage." A week. Hannah's heart sank. She couldn't impose on Caleb Reed's hospitality for a week, couldn't risk whatever debt that might create. Martha must have seen something in her face, because she patted Hannah's hand. "Don't you worry about Caleb. He's got more room here than he knows what to do with, and he's too stubborn to admit he likes the company. You just focus on healing." She unpacked her basket, fresh bread, butter, eggs, a jar of preserves, and set about making breakfast as if she'd done it 100 times before. Caleb watched her with the resigned expression of a man who knew better than to argue with Martha Hollis about anything. Within 20 minutes, they were all sitting around the table eating scrambled eggs and toast with jam, and Hannah couldn't remember the last time food had tasted so good. Luke ate steadily, methodically, like he was afraid it might disappear if he stopped. Martha kept up a steady stream of conversation, asking Hannah about where they'd come from and where they were going, offering news about the area, who'd had a good calving season, whose well had run dry, which family was leaving for Oregon. "Your sister's place near Buffalo," Martha said thoughtfully. "What's her name?" "Sarah Patterson," Hannah said. "She married a man with a homestead up there about 5 years ago." Martha's face brightened. "I know the Pattersons. Good people. They came through here last winter on their way to Cheyenne for supplies. Sarah's expecting a baby, isn't she?" Hannah blinked. I don't know. We haven't had word in over a year." "Well, she was expecting last I heard. Should have had the baby by now." Martha smiled. "That'll be nice for young Luke here, a cousin to play with." Luke looked interested at this prospect, and Hannah felt a small flutter of hope. Maybe Sarah's life had worked out the way she'd hoped. Maybe there would be room for Hannah and Luke after all. After breakfast, Martha insisted on washing the dishes while Caleb took Luke outside to feed the chickens and check on the horses. Hannah watched them go, seeing the way Luke stayed close to Caleb's side, listening intently to everything the man said. "He's a good man," Martha said quietly, following Hannah's gaze. "Caleb, keeps to himself mostly, but he's the first one to help when trouble comes. Fixed my roof last spring when the wind tore half the shingles off. Wouldn't take a penny for it." "Why does he live alone?" Hannah asked, then immediately regretted the question. It was too personal, too prying. But Martha didn't seem to mind. She dried a plate thoughtfully. "His wife died about 3 years back. Fever, same as took a lot of folks that winter. They'd only been married 2 years. No children." She set the plate on the shelf. "He hasn't been the same since. Quieter, if you can believe it. Works himself half to death most days, like he's trying to outrun something." Hannah absorbed this information in silence. So Caleb Reed knew loss, same as her. Maybe that's why he'd stopped for them. because he remembered what it felt like to be helpless, to need help, and have nowhere to turn. Martha finished the dishes and dried her hands. "I'll come by again tomorrow," she said. "Bring some more food, maybe some books for the boy if I can find any. In the meantime, you do what Caleb tells you about that leg. He's got a good head for healing, even if he won't admit it." After Martha left, the cabin felt very quiet again. Hannah could hear Luke's laughter outside, high and clear, and Caleb's deeper voice responding. She eased herself to the window and looked out. Luke was sitting on the porch steps, watching Caleb mend a section of fence. The boy was asking questions. Hannah could tell by the tilt of his head, the way he leaned forward, and Caleb was answering, demonstrating with his hands, letting Luke hold the hammer. Something in Hannah's chest tightened. Luke had been so serious for so long, carrying burdens no 6-year-old should have to carry. Seeing him like this, curious, engaged, almost carefree, reminded her of who he used to be before Thomas died, before hunger and fear became their constant companions. She turned away from the window and lowered herself carefully back onto the bed. Her leg throbbed dully, a reminder that she wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. The next few days fell into an unexpected rhythm. Caleb rose before dawn and went out to work, mending fences, tending his small herd of cattle, fixing whatever needed fixing. Luke followed him like a shadow, and Caleb seemed content with the company, teaching the boy small tasks, letting him help with chores. Hannah stayed inside, resting her leg as ordered, though it chafed at her to be idle. She wasn't used to sitting still, wasn't used to letting someone else provide. But Martha came by daily with food and conversation, and gradually Hannah found herself relaxing into the strange safety of Caleb's cabin. On the third morning, Hannah woke to find Caleb already up, standing at the stove stirring something in a pot. Luke was still asleep beside her, one arm flung over his head. "Morning," Caleb said without turning around. "Morning." Hannah eased herself upright, testing her leg. The swelling was almost gone now, and she could bend the knee without too much pain. "What are you making?" "Oatmeal." He ladled some into a bowl and brought it to her, along with a spoon and a cup of coffee. "How's the leg?" "Much better." Caleb nodded, but his expression was thoughtful. "Good enough to walk?" Hannah's stomach dropped. Was he asking because he wanted her to leave? "I can manage," she said carefully. "That's not what I asked." Caleb sat down at the table, his own bowl in front of him. "Can you walk without pain, without risking permanent damage?" Hannah considered lying, but something about the directness in his eyes stopped her. "Not yet," she admitted. "Maybe in another few days." "Then you'll stay another few days," Caleb said simply. "No point leaving before you're ready." "Mr. Reed—" "Caleb," he interrupted. "If you're going to stay in my house, you might as well use my name." Hannah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Caleb, then. I can't keep imposing on your hospitality. You've already done more than—" "You're not imposing," Caleb said flatly. "I offered. You accepted. That's the end of it." "But why?" Hannah asked, the question bursting out before she could stop it. "Why are you helping us?" "What do you want?" Caleb looked at her for a long moment, his gray eyes steady. "I don't want anything, Mrs. Moore. You needed help. I gave it. That's how things are supposed to work." "That's not how the world works," Hannah said bitterly. "Not in my experience." "Then your experience has been hard," Caleb said quietly. "I'm sorry for that, but it doesn't change what I said. You and the boy are welcome here as long as you need to stay." Hannah didn't know what to say to that. She'd spent so long bracing herself against disappointment, against betrayal, that simple kindness felt almost dangerous, like something that would be taken away the moment she started to rely on it. Luke stirred and woke, rubbing his eyes. "Morning, Mama. Morning, Caleb." "Morning, Luke," Caleb said. "You hungry?" "Yes, sir." As Caleb dished out oatmeal for the boy, Hannah watched the easy way they interacted, the way Luke trusted him already, the way Caleb spoke to him like a person, not a child to be managed. It should have worried her, this quick attachment, but instead, it filled her with a complicated mix of gratitude and grief. This was what Luke needed, a steady presence, a man who could teach him things, show him how to be in the world, things Hannah couldn't give him, no matter how hard she tried. After breakfast, Caleb announced he was riding out to check on his cattle and would be gone most of the day. Martha's coming by around noon, he told Hannah. You need anything before I go? Hannah shook her head. We'll be fine. Caleb nodded and headed for the door, then paused. Luke, you want to come with me? Luke's face lit up. Can I, Mama? Hannah hesitated. The thought of being separated from her son, even for a few hours, made her chest tight. But she saw the hope in Luke's eyes and knew she couldn't say no. Stay close to Caleb, she said, and do what he tells you. I will! Luke was already pulling on the clothes Martha had brought, practically vibrating with excitement. Caleb helped him saddle up. Luke rode in front, small hands gripping the saddle horn, and then they were gone, leaving Hannah alone in the quiet cabin. She spent the morning doing what she could to be useful. She couldn't stand for long, but she could sit at the table and mend Caleb's shirts, which were in desperate need of it. She found his sewing kit in the chest and set to work, her fingers remembering the familiar rhythm of needle and thread. It felt good to do something, to contribute in some small way. She couldn't pay Caleb back with money, but she could do this. Martha arrived at noon with fresh bread and a cheerful commentary on the weather. She settled into the other chair and picked up one of Caleb's socks, which had a hole the size of a silver dollar in the heel. That man, Martha said, shaking her head, works himself to death and can't be bothered to darn a sock. I swear, if his wife could see him now, she'd box his ears. What was she like? Hannah asked. His wife. Martha's expression softened. Emma? Sweet girl. Gentle but tougher than she looked. She loved Caleb something fierce, and he loved her right back. When she died, Martha trailed off, focusing on her darning. Well, it near about killed him. He stopped talking much after that. Stopped going to town except when he had to. Just worked and worked and worked. Hannah thought about the man who'd lifted her onto his horse, who'd wrapped her knee with gentle hands, who'd let her 6-year-old son trail after him without complaint. He didn't seem like a man destroyed by grief. But maybe that was the point. Maybe the work was how he survived it. Why hasn't he remarried? Hannah asked. Martha shrugged. I don't think he's ready. Maybe he never will be. Some people love once and that's all they've got in them. She glanced at Hannah. What about you? You thinking about marrying again? The question caught Hannah off guard. No, I haven't thought about it. Liar, Martha said cheerfully. Every widow thinks about it, whether she admits it or not. It's practical. A woman alone with a child has a hard road. I'm managing, Hannah said stiffly. Are you? Martha's voice was gentle now. Hannah, I don't mean to pry, but walking 80 miles on a bad leg, getting turned away from farms, collapsing on the road, that's not managing. That's surviving by your fingernails. Hannah's throat tightened. She focused on the shirt in her hands, on the precise placement of each stitch. I'm not trying to make you feel bad, Martha continued. I'm just saying, there's no shame in accepting help when you need it, or in building a new life when the old one's gone. I'm going to my sister's, Hannah said. She'll help us. And if she can't? Martha asked quietly. New baby, struggling homestead. Sometimes family doesn't have room, even when they want to help. Hannah had thought the same thing 100 times, but hearing someone else say it out loud made it real in a way she couldn't bear. She set down the shirt, her hands shaking. I don't know what else to do, she whispered. Martha reached across the table and took her hand. You do what you're doing now. You rest, you heal, you let people help you, and when the time comes to move on, you'll be stronger for it. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the whisper of thread through cloth. Finally, Martha squeezed Hannah's hand and released it. Now, she said briskly, tell me about this boy of yours. Caleb says he's sharp as a tack. Hannah felt herself smile despite everything. He is. He taught himself numbers from watching his father count cattle. He can add and subtract in his head faster than I can with paper. Well then, Martha said, when you get to your sister's, you make sure he gets some schooling. Smart boy like that shouldn't waste it. They talked until mid-afternoon when Martha gathered her things and headed home. Hannah returned to her mending, working until the light began to fade and she heard hoofbeats outside. The door opened and Luke burst in, dusty and sunbright, talking a mile a minute. Mama, we saw a hawk catch a rabbit, and Caleb showed me how to track deer. You look at the prints and see which way they're going, and I helped move the cattle to a new pasture, and Caleb said, I was a real help, and slow down, Hannah laughed, pulling him into a hug. Let me look at you. Luke was filthy, his face streaked with dirt, his new clothes already showing signs of hard wear, but his eyes were bright, brighter than she'd seen them in months, and when she smoothed his hair back from his forehead, he was grinning. Caleb came in behind him, looking equally dusty but unfazed. Boy did good today, he said, hanging his hat on the peg. Listened well, worked hard. I'm proud of you, Hannah told Luke, and meant it. That night, after dinner, and after Luke had finally worn himself out with talking and fallen asleep, Hannah and Caleb sat at the table in the firelight. Caleb was cleaning his rifle, his movements methodical and practiced. Hannah was finishing the last of the mending. Thank you for today, she said quietly, for taking him with you. He needed that. Caleb glanced up. He's a good kid, smart. You've done well with him. I've done the best I could, Hannah said. It hasn't always been enough. Seems like enough to me, Caleb said. He set down the rifle and looked at her directly. You've kept him safe, kept him fed, kept him moving forward. That's more than a lot of mothers manage. Hannah felt something crack open inside her chest. I collapsed on the side of the road, she said, her voice breaking. I couldn't even walk. If you hadn't come along, but I did, Caleb interrupted. And you're both here now, safe and healing. That's what matters. Hannah wiped at her eyes, frustrated by the tears that kept coming. I'm sorry, I don't usually... Don't apologize, Caleb said. You've been carrying a heavy load for a long time. It's all right to set it down for a minute. They sat in silence while Hannah pulled herself together. When she could speak again, she said, How much longer do you think before I can walk to Buffalo? Caleb considered. Another week, maybe, if the leg keeps improving, but I've been thinking, might be better if I drive you there. Got a wagon, be easier on your leg than walking. Hannah's heart jumped. I couldn't ask you to do that. You're not asking, I'm offering. Caleb picked up his rifle again, reassembling it with practiced ease. Buffalo's not far. I need to go into town for supplies anyway. Might as well make it a full trip. Why are you doing all this? Hannah asked, the question softer this time, less accusatory. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, When Emma died, I wanted to die too. Came real close to it, actually. Stopped eating, stopped sleeping, just worked until I couldn't see straight. Would have killed myself with it if Martha hadn't forced me to sit down and eat a real meal. He paused, his hands still on the rifle. Point is, people helped me when I couldn't help myself. Figured it was time I passed that along. Hannah looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the weight he carried, same as her. Different losses, different scars, but the same fundamental understanding that survival was sometimes the best you could hope for. Thank you, she said simply. Caleb nodded and went back to his work. And Hannah, for the first time in longer than she could remember, felt something that might have been peace. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal, though Hannah kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. She'd learned not to trust comfort, not to believe in safety that came without strings attached. But Caleb Reed seemed determined to prove her wrong on both counts. By the end of the week, Hannah could walk without limping, though the knee still ached if she put too much weight on it. Martha had declared her well enough to start moving around, so long as she didn't overdo it, and Hannah took the pronouncement as permission to make herself useful. She started cooking meals, taking over the kitchen that Caleb had been managing with the bare minimum of effort. She cleaned the cabin properly, scrubbing floors and washing windows, organizing shelves that had clearly never been organized in their life. She even tackled Caleb's laundry, which had been piling up in a corner like he'd forgotten laundry existed. Caleb didn't comment on any of it, but she caught him looking at the clean windows with something that might have been surprise. And when he came in to find dinner waiting on the table, actual dinner, not just beans and cornbread, he'd paused in the doorway like he wasn't sure he was in the right house. You didn't have to do all this, he said finally. I needed to do something, Hannah replied, setting a plate in front of him. I can't just sit idle while you're working all day. You're supposed to be resting. I've rested enough. Caleb looked like he wanted to argue, but Luke chose that moment to ask if he could go out to the barn after dinner, and the conversation shifted. Hannah counted it as a victory. That night, after Luke was asleep and the dishes were done, Caleb pulled out a piece of paper and a stubby pencil and started writing. Hannah watched him from the corner of her eye, curious but not wanting to pry. After a few minutes, Caleb looked up. "You said your sister's name is Sarah Patterson?" "That's right." "I'm writing her a letter," Caleb said, "letting her know you're here and that you'll be arriving in about a week. That way she won't worry when you show up." Hannah felt something warm unfold in her chest. "You don't have to do that." "Seems practical," Caleb said. "I'll have someone take it to town tomorrow. Mail runs once a week. She should get it before we arrive." Hannah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. It was such a small thing, really, a letter to let her sister know she was coming. But it felt huge. This evidence that Caleb was thinking ahead, planning for her future, making sure she'd be taken care of even after she left his cabin. She picked up her mending to have something to do with her hands. "What will you tell her?" "The truth," Caleb said simply. "That you were traveling to Buffalo, that you got hurt, that you've been staying here until you heal, that I'll bring you to her place next week." "She'll think—" Hannah stopped, biting her lip. "She'll think what?" Hannah looked down at the shirt in her hands. "That there's something improper going on. A widow staying in a bachelor's cabin." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Let her think what she wants. You know the truth. I know the truth. That's all that matters." But it wasn't all that matters, and they both knew it. Reputation was currency for women, especially widows. One wrong assumption could follow Hannah for years, could make it harder for her to find work, to remarry if she chose, to build any kind of life. As if reading her thoughts, Caleb added, "I'll mention Mrs. Hollis in the letter. Make it clear you've had a chaperone. That should help." Hannah felt her shoulders relax slightly. "Thank you." They worked in companionable silence after that, the only sounds the scratch of Caleb's pencil and the crackle of the fire. When Hannah finally set aside her mending and announced she was going to sleep, Caleb looked up from his letter. "Hannah," he said, and it was the first time he'd used her given name. "You've done good work here. The cabin, it feels different, better. I just wanted you to know I appreciate it." Hannah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "It's the least I could do." "Maybe," Caleb said. "But you didn't have to, so thank you." Hannah nodded and retreated to the bed, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. She lay there in the dark, listening to Caleb finish his letter, listening to him bank the fire and settle onto his blanket on the floor. And she thought about what it might be like to stay here, in this quiet cabin with this quiet man, instead of walking away toward an uncertain future. But that was foolishness. Caleb had made it clear he was helping her out of kindness, nothing more. And Hannah had no business thinking about anything beyond getting herself and Luke to safety. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Hannah was kneading bread at the table when she heard the sound of wagon wheels and voices outside. Caleb, who'd been fixing a loose board on the porch, called out a greeting, and Hannah wiped her hands on her apron and moved to the window. 3 men were climbing down from a wagon, ranchers by the look of them, weathered and work-worn. Caleb shook hands with each one, and Hannah could see them talking, gesturing toward the north. After a few minutes, Caleb came inside. "Neighbors," he explained, "Tom Fletcher and his sons. They're heading to town and offered to take my letter to your sister." "That's kind of them." "Tom's good people." Caleb picked up the letter from the table, now sealed with wax. "I'm going to talk with them for a bit. You all right here?" Hannah nodded, and Caleb headed back outside. Through the window, she watched the men talking, saw the way they glanced toward the cabin with undisguised curiosity. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but she could guess. Word would spread fast about the widow woman staying at Caleb Reed's place. By the end of the week, half the territory would probably know. The thought should have bothered her more than it did. But somehow, standing in this clean cabin with bread rising on the table and Luke playing quietly in the corner, she found she didn't care as much as she should. When the men finally left, Caleb came back inside and poured himself a cup of coffee. "They're having a barn raising next month," he said. "Tom invited us." "Us?" Hannah repeated. Caleb looked uncomfortable. "Well, me. But I said you and Luke might still be in the area, and he said you'd be welcome too." He paused. That was presumptuous. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have assumed. It's fine, Hannah interrupted. I doubt we'll still be here, but it was kind of him to offer. Caleb nodded and retreated to his coffee, and Hannah went back to her bread, and neither of them acknowledged the way the cabin felt a little emptier at the reminder that this arrangement was temporary. That afternoon, Martha arrived with her usual basket of supplies and her usual flood of conversation. But today she also brought news. The Pattersons sent word, she announced, settling into her chair. Your sister's doing well. Baby's healthy. A little girl. They're expecting you whenever you arrive. Hannah felt relief wash over her. Sarah's all right then? More than all right, from what I hear. She and her husband are making a good go of it. Martha paused, her expression turning serious. But Hannah, you should know, it's a small cabin, 2 rooms. With the baby and Sarah still recovering, space is going to be tight. Hannah had expected as much, but hearing it confirmed still felt like a blow. We'll manage, she said. Luke doesn't take up much room. I'm not saying they won't take you in, Martha said quickly. Just that it might be cramped for a while, until you figure out your next step. I can work, Hannah said. I can help with the baby, help Sarah however she needs. I'm not expecting to just sit idle. I know you're not. Martha reached over and patted her hand. You're a worker. I can see that. You'll do fine. I just want you to go in with your eyes open. After Martha left, Hannah couldn't shake the weight that had settled over her. She'd been so focused on getting to Sarah, on reaching that one point of safety, that she hadn't thought much beyond it. But now she had to face the reality. Sarah's cabin was small. Sarah had a newborn and a husband and a homestead to run. There might not be room for Hannah and Luke, not long term. Which meant Hannah needed a plan. Needed to figure out how to support herself and her son without relying on her sister's charity. That evening, after dinner, Hannah brought it up with Caleb. I need to find work, she said, in Buffalo or somewhere nearby. Do you know if there are any opportunities? Caleb considered. Town's growing. There's a hotel that might need help. Maybe the general store. And there's always laundry and sewing work if you're willing. I'm willing, Hannah said firmly. I'll do whatever needs doing. What about Luke? Who'll watch him while you're working? Hannah hadn't thought that far ahead. I'll figure something out. Maybe Sarah can help, or I can find someone. Or he could go to school, Caleb said. There's a schoolhouse in Buffalo. Teacher's supposed to be decent. Hannah's throat tightened. School. She'd wanted that for Luke, wanted him to have the education she'd never gotten. But school cost money, and she wasn't sure she could afford it. Maybe eventually, she said carefully. Caleb looked like he wanted to say something else, but Luke chose that moment to wander over, asking Caleb about the stars he could see through the window. And the conversation shifted to constellations and navigation, and Hannah was grateful for the reprieve. But later, lying in bed while Luke slept beside her, Hannah let herself think about the future, about what her life might look like a month from now, a year from now. Working in a hotel or taking in laundry, living in a cramped cabin, or maybe a rented room somewhere, scraping by the way she'd been scraping by for the past year. It wasn't much of a future, but it was survival, and survival was something Hannah knew how to do. The week passed quickly. Hannah's leg continued to improve until she could walk without pain, could stand for long periods without needing to sit. Luke spent his days following Caleb, learning about cattle and horses and all the practical skills a boy growing up in the territory needed to know. And Caleb, quiet as ever, made preparations for the journey to Buffalo. On the night before they were set to leave, Martha came for dinner. She brought a pot roast and potatoes, and they ate together around the table like a family, talking and laughing about nothing in particular. Luke told stories about the hawk he'd seen that morning, and Martha teased Caleb about finally learning to darn his own socks. And for a few hours, Hannah let herself forget that tomorrow everything would change. After Martha left and Luke was asleep, Hannah packed their few belongings into the bundle she'd carried from Cheyenne. It didn't take long. They didn't have much. Caleb was outside checking the wagon, making sure everything was ready for the morning. Hannah could see him through the window, moving methodically in the lamplight. She watched him for a moment, then made a decision. She stepped outside into the cool evening air. Caleb looked up from the wagon wheel he'd been examining. Everything all right? He asked. I just wanted to thank you, Hannah said, properly, for everything you've done for us. The kindness you've shown, I don't know how to repay it." "You don't need to repay it," Caleb said. "I know, but I want you to understand what it meant, what it still means." Hannah wrapped her arms around herself against the night chill. "When you found us on that road, I'd given up. I thought that was it, that we'd die out there and no one would even know. And then you came along and you helped us. No questions asked, no price demanded. You gave us time to heal and rest and just be safe for a while. That's everything." Caleb shifted his weight, uncomfortable with the praise. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Hannah said firmly. "They wouldn't have. I've learned that the hard way. Most people see someone in trouble and they look the other way. But you didn't. You stopped. You helped. And I need you to know that I'll never forget that." For a long moment, Caleb just looked at her, his gray eyes unreadable in the lamplight. Then he said quietly, "You would have done the same. If you'd been the one on the horse, and I'd been the one on the road. I can see it in you, that kind of strength." Hannah felt tears prick at her eyes. "I don't feel strong." "You are, though," Caleb said. "Strongest person I've met in a long time. Walking 80 miles on a bad leg to get your boy somewhere safe. Most people would have given up long before that. I didn't have a choice." "You always have a choice," Caleb said. "You chose to keep going. That's strength." They stood there in the quiet night, the space between them filled with all the things neither of them knew how to say. Finally, Hannah nodded and turned back toward the cabin. "Hannah," Caleb said, and she stopped. "If things don't work out with your sister, if you need help or a place to stay or anything at all, you can come back here. The door's always open." Hannah's breath caught. "Caleb, I mean it," he said. "You and Luke. Any time." Hannah nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and went inside. She lay awake for a long time that night, listening to the familiar sounds of the cabin settling, thinking about the journey ahead and the uncertain future waiting at the end of it. And she thought about Caleb's words, "The door's always open," and what it might mean to have a place to return to, a person who'd welcome her back without judgment or expectation. Morning came too soon. Hannah woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Caleb moving around the cabin, gathering supplies for the trip. Luke bounced out of bed, excited about the wagon ride, chattering about how far they'd go and what they might see. Hannah dressed carefully in the cleanest of her dresses, braided her hair, and helped Luke with his clothes. When she came to the table, Caleb had breakfast ready, eggs and bacon and the last of the bread she'd baked 2 days ago. They ate quickly and in relative silence, the weight of departure hanging over them. When the meal was done, Caleb loaded their bundle into the wagon along with the supplies he was taking to town. Then he helped Hannah up onto the wagon seat and lifted Luke up beside her. The sun was just starting to rise as Caleb climbed up and took the reins. He didn't say anything, just clicked to the horses and started them moving down the road toward Buffalo. Hannah looked back once at the cabin growing smaller behind them. It sat peaceful in the morning light, smoke rising from the chimney, chickens scratching in the yard. It looked like home, she thought, and the realization hurt more than she expected. The journey to Buffalo took most of the day. The road was rough but passable, winding through sage-covered hills and across shallow creeks. Caleb drove with the same quiet competence he brought to everything else, pointing out landmarks to Luke, stopping once to water the horses and let them all stretch their legs. Hannah watched the landscape roll by and tried not to think about what came next. Tried not to think about how Luke kept asking Caleb questions, or how Caleb kept answering them with the patience of someone who genuinely enjoyed the company. Tried not to think about how comfortable she'd become in Caleb's presence, how easy it was to sit beside him without needing to fill the silence with talk. They reached Buffalo in late afternoon, when the sun was starting its descent toward the horizon. The town was bigger than Hannah expected, a proper main street with a hotel, a general store, a church, even a small schoolhouse. People moved along the wooden sidewalks, going about their business, and Hannah felt both relieved and anxious at the sight of so much civilization. Caleb stopped the wagon in front of the general store. "Wait here," he said. "I'll ask about the Patterson place." He disappeared inside and returned a few minutes later with directions. "About 2 miles north," he reported, climbing back onto the wagon. "Past the creek, look for the white fence." They found the place easily enough. A tidy homestead with a cabin, a barn, and a garden plot. Chickens scattered as the wagon pulled up, and a moment later the cabin door opened. Sarah Patterson emerged, and Hannah's breath caught. Her sister looked older than Hannah remembered, worn down by hard work and motherhood. But her face lit up with recognition and joy when she saw Hannah in the wagon. "Hannah!" Sarah hurried forward, her arms outstretched. "You made it! Thank heavens you made it!" Hannah climbed down from the wagon and found herself pulled into a fierce hug. She held on tight, feeling Sarah's solid warmth, breathing in the familiar scent of her sister's hair. "I'm here," Hannah whispered. "We're here." Sarah pulled back, tears streaming down her face. She looked at Luke, who was watching from the wagon with wide eyes. "And this must be Luke. My goodness, you've grown so big." Luke smiled shyly, and Sarah reached up to help him down. Then she turned to Caleb, wiping her eyes. "You must be Mr. Reed," she said. "I got your letter. I can't thank you enough for what you've done for my sister and nephew." "No thanks needed," Caleb said, tipping his hat. "I'm glad I could help." Sarah's husband appeared from the barn, a tall, thin man with kind eyes and work-roughened hands. He introduced himself as David and shook Caleb's hand, thanking him profusely for bringing Hannah and Luke safely. "Come inside," Sarah urged, "both of you. I've got stew on and bread fresh from this morning." Hannah glanced at Caleb, who hesitated. "I should get back before dark," he said. "Nonsense," David said firmly. "It's too late to make that trip tonight. You'll stay for dinner at least, and we can put you up in the barn if you need a place to sleep." Caleb looked like he wanted to refuse, but Sarah was already ushering everyone toward the cabin, and resistance seemed futile. Inside, the cabin was small but well kept, with a main room that served as kitchen and living area, and a single bedroom visible through a doorway. A cradle sat by the fireplace, and Hannah could see a tiny bundle inside. "That's Margaret," Sarah said proudly. "Born 6 weeks ago. She's sleeping now, thank the stars. Doesn't happen often." They settled around the table, and Sarah served stew and bread while asking Hannah 1,000 questions about the journey, about Luke, about what had happened since Thomas died. Hannah answered as best she could, editing out the worst parts, focusing on the fact that they'd made it. They were here. They were safe. Throughout the meal, Hannah watched Sarah and David interact, the way they moved around each other with practiced ease, the way David's hand rested on Sarah's shoulder when he passed behind her chair, the way they looked at each other when they thought no one was watching. They were happy, she realized, tired and struggling maybe, but fundamentally happy. After dinner, while Sarah fed the baby and David took Caleb out to see the barn, Hannah helped clean up. When they were alone, Sarah turned to her. "Hannah, I need to be honest with you," she said, her voice low. "We're glad you're here, truly. But space is tight. I don't know how long—" "I know," Hannah interrupted gently. "I understand. I'm already looking for work. I won't be a burden on you." Sarah's eyes filled with tears again. "You could never be a burden. You're my sister. But with the baby and David working so hard to get the crops in, and money being what it is—" "I know," Hannah said again. "It's all right. We'll figure it out." Sarah squeezed her hand and nodded, relief and guilt warring in her expression. They finished the dishes in silence, and when the men came back inside, David announced that Caleb would indeed stay the night in the barn, and wouldn't hear any argument about it. That evening, after Luke had fallen asleep on a pallet Sarah had made up in the corner, the adults sat around the table drinking coffee and talking in low voices so as not to wake the children. David spoke about his plans for the homestead, about the challenges of farming in territory where water was scarce and the growing season short. Sarah talked about the baby, about how different motherhood was from what she'd imagined. And Caleb, when asked, spoke briefly about his ranch, his cattle, the work that kept him occupied. Hannah mostly listened, absorbing the reality of her sister's life. It was clear that David and Sarah were making it work, but just barely. Every penny mattered. Every decision was weighed against survival. There was no cushion here, no room for extra mouths to feed beyond what charity and family obligation demanded. When the conversation wound down and exhaustion settled over them all, Caleb stood and thanked them for their hospitality. He turned to Hannah, and for a moment their eyes met across the small room. "You take care of yourself," he said quietly. "And Luke?" "I will," Hannah promised. And remember what I said." His voice was so low only she could hear it. "The door's always open." Hannah nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She watched him put on his hat and head out to the barn, watched until the door closed behind him and he disappeared into the darkness. Then she turned to find Sarah watching her with knowing eyes. "He's a good man," Sarah said softly. "He is," Hannah agreed. "More than good, maybe." Hannah didn't answer. She helped Sarah clean up the last of the dishes, said goodnight, and lay down on the pallet beside Luke. But sleep didn't come easily. She kept thinking about Caleb alone in the barn, about the long ride he'd face tomorrow back to his empty cabin. Kept thinking about the quiet way he'd said the door's always open, like he meant it, like he hoped she might need to use it. Morning came gray and cool, with clouds building on the horizon promising rain. Hannah woke to hear Caleb's voice outside and the sound of harness jingling. She rose carefully, trying not to wake Luke, and slipped outside. Caleb was hitching up his wagon, preparing to leave. He looked up when he heard the door and gave her a small nod. "Didn't want to wake anyone," he said. "Figured I'd get an early start." Hannah walked over to him, wrapping her shawl tighter against the morning chill. "Thank you," she said, "for everything, for bringing us here safely, for all of it." Caleb finished with the harness and turned to face her fully. In the gray morning light, his eyes looked more silver than gray, clear and steady. "You gonna be all right here?" Hannah wanted to say yes with confidence, wanted to sound certain and capable. But standing here in her sister's yard with reality pressing in from all sides, she couldn't quite manage it. "I'm going to try," she said instead. Caleb studied her face for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. "This is for you," he said, pressing it into her hand. "Don't argue." Hannah opened the pouch and found coins inside, more money than she'd seen in months. Her eyes widened. "Caleb, I can't." "You can, and you will," he said firmly. "Consider it payment for all the work you did at the cabin. The cooking, the cleaning, the mending. You earned it." "That's not—" "I didn't do that for money." "I know," Caleb said, "but I'm giving it to you anyway. Use it for Luke. Get him into that school. Buy him what he needs." Hannah's eyes filled with tears. She looked down at the pouch in her hand, at this impossible gift, and couldn't find words big enough to hold her gratitude. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Don't say anything," Caleb replied. "Just take care of yourself. And if you need anything at all, you know where to find me." He climbed up onto the wagon seat before Hannah could respond, before she could tell him that she didn't deserve this, that he'd already done too much. He picked up the reins and looked down at her one more time. "Goodbye, Hannah." "Goodbye, Caleb." He clicked to the horses and the wagon rolled forward, wheels crunching on the hard-packed earth. Hannah stood there watching until the wagon disappeared around the bend in the road, until there was nothing left but dust settling in the morning air and the weight of the coin pouch in her hand. When she went back inside, Sarah was up and nursing the baby. She glanced at Hannah's face and then at the pouch still clutched in her hand. "He gave you money?" Sarah asked quietly. Hannah nodded, unable to speak. Sarah's expression softened. "That man's half in love with you already. You know that?" "Don't," Hannah said, her voice breaking. "Don't say that." "Why not?" "It's true. Anyone with eyes could see it." "It doesn't matter," Hannah said. "I'm here now. This is where I need to be, for Luke." Sarah looked like she wanted to argue, but the baby fussed and she turned her attention back to nursing. Hannah tucked the coin pouch into her pocket and went to wake Luke, pushing away the hollow feeling in her chest that felt too much like grief. The first week at Sarah's homestead passed in a blur of adjustment. Hannah threw herself into being useful, helping with every task she could find. She cooked meals and washed clothes and minded the baby when Sarah needed rest. She weeded the struggling garden and fed the chickens and scrubbed floors that didn't need scrubbing just to feel like she was earning her keep. Luke, for his part, adapted quickly. He helped David with small chores around the homestead, carried water from the creek, collected eggs. But Hannah could see the questions in his eyes, the way he'd sometimes look toward the road as if expecting to see a familiar wagon appear. "Do you think Caleb's all right?" Luke asked one evening as Hannah was tucking him in. "I'm sure he is," Hannah said, smoothing his hair back. "I miss him." Hannah's throat tightened. "I know, sweetheart. Can we visit him sometime? Maybe, Hannah said, knowing it was a lie even as she said it. Now go to sleep. But Luke's question stayed with her, echoing through the small cabin, reminding her of things she was trying very hard not to think about. By the end of the second week, Hannah had made good on her promise to find work. She'd gone into Buffalo and secured a position at the hotel, cleaning rooms and helping with laundry 3 days a week. It wasn't much money, but combined with what Caleb had given her, it was enough to contribute to Sarah's household and still save a little for Luke's schooling. She'd also enrolled Luke in the town school, using part of Caleb's gift to pay the fees. The teacher, a stern but fair woman named Miss Adams, had tested Luke's knowledge and declared him ahead of most children his age in arithmetic, though behind in reading and writing. Luke had been nervous at first, but he'd come home that first day with stories about the other children and the things he was learning, and Hannah had felt a weight lift from her shoulders. He was getting the education she'd dreamed of for him. But as the weeks turned into a month, the strain of living in such close quarters began to show. The cabin that had seemed cozy now felt cramped, with 5 people and a crying baby sharing 2 small rooms. David grew quiet and withdrawn, clearly uncomfortable with the disruption to his household routine. Sarah tried to keep the peace, but Hannah could see the exhaustion in her sister's eyes, the way she jumped at every sound the baby made, the tension in her shoulders that never quite eased. Hannah knew she couldn't stay much longer, not like this. She began looking for other options. She asked around town about rooms for rent, but everything was either too expensive or unsuitable for a woman and child alone. She inquired about live-in positions, but the few available required her to leave Luke behind, and that was something she refused to consider. One evening, about 6 weeks after arriving at Sarah's, Hannah sat at the table counting her savings while everyone else slept. She'd managed to save a decent amount between her wages and what was left of Caleb's gift, but it wasn't enough for a place of their own. Not even close. She heard movement behind her and turned to find Sarah standing in the doorway, the baby asleep on her shoulder. "Can't sleep?" Sarah asked quietly. "Just thinking." Sarah sat down across from her, adjusting the baby carefully. "You're thinking about leaving." It wasn't a question. Hannah sighed. "I can't stay here forever, Sarah. You know that." "Where will you go?" "I don't know yet. I'm working on it." Sarah was quiet for a moment, gently patting the baby's back. "You could go back to him, you know, to Mr. Reed." Hannah stiffened. "I'm not going to impose on him again." "It wouldn't be imposing if he invited you." "He was just being kind." "Hannah," Sarah said, her voice gentle but firm, "I saw the way he looked at you. That wasn't just kindness. And I saw the way you looked at him too, even if you won't admit it." "It doesn't matter how we looked at each other," Hannah said, keeping her voice low so as not to wake the others. "I have Luke to think about. I can't run to a man every time things get difficult. I need to stand on my own." "Why?" Sarah asked. "Why does standing on your own mean being alone? What's wrong with accepting help from someone who cares about you?" "Because help always has a price," Hannah said, the words coming out sharper than she intended. "Maybe not right away, maybe not obviously, but eventually there's always a price. And I won't put myself or Luke in that position again." Sarah's eyes filled with sympathy. "Thomas was a good man, Hannah. Not all men are like whatever you're imagining." "I know that," Hannah said, "but I also know I need to be able to take care of myself and my son without depending on anyone else. That's just reality." Sarah looked like she wanted to argue more, but the baby stirred and began to fuss. She stood rocking gently. "Just think about it," she said. "That's all I ask. Don't let fear keep you from something that could be good." After Sarah went back to bed, Hannah sat alone in the darkness for a long time. She thought about Caleb's cabin, about the peace she'd felt there, the safety. She thought about the way Luke had followed Caleb around, learning and growing and becoming more like his old self every day. She thought about quiet evenings by the fire and the easy companionship of working alongside someone who understood what loss felt like. And she thought about what it might mean to go back, to walk into Caleb's life again with nothing to offer but herself and her son, and the hope that his invitation had been genuine. The thought terrified her. The next morning, Hannah went to town for her shift at the hotel. She was scrubbing floors in the hallway when she overheard 2 women talking in one of the rooms. "Did you hear about Caleb Reed?" one of them was saying. Martha Hollis says he's taken sick. Bad from the sound of it. Hannah's hand stilled on the scrub brush. What kind of sick? The other woman asked. Fever. Been laid up for near a week now. Martha's been going out there every day to check on him, but she says he won't let her do much. Stubborn man. Someone should send for the doctor. Martha tried. He won't have it. Says it's just a fever and it'll pass. The women moved on to other topics, but Hannah couldn't hear them anymore. Her heart was pounding, her mind racing. Caleb was sick. Bad enough that Martha was worried, and he was alone out there, too stubborn to get proper help. She finished her work in a daze, barely aware of what she was doing. When her shift ended, she didn't go back to Sarah's. Instead, she went to the general store and found Martha Hollis examining bolts of fabric. Mrs. Hollis, Hannah said, trying to keep her voice steady. I heard about Caleb. Is he all right? Martha looked up, her expression troubled. Hannah, I was wondering if word would reach you. He's not good, I'll be honest. High fever, barely eating. I've been trying to get him to see sense, but you know how he is. How long has he been sick? Going on 10 days now, started right after he got back from bringing you to Buffalo. Martha shook her head. I think he wore himself down, working too hard after you left. Man doesn't know how to take care of himself. Hannah felt something cold settle in her stomach. I need to see him. Martha studied her face. I was hoping you'd say that. Truth is, he needs someone there full time, someone who can make sure he eats, make sure he doesn't do something foolish. I can't be there all day. I've got my own place to run. I can go, Hannah said. I can stay with him until he's better. What about your position here, and your sister? I'll figure it out, Hannah said. Can you take me to him? Martha didn't hesitate. Give me 10 minutes to settle my account here. Meet me at my wagon. Hannah waited outside, her mind spinning. She should go to Sarah first, should explain, should make arrangements for Luke, but the urgency pounding through her veins wouldn't let her wait. Caleb needed help. Nothing else mattered. Martha emerged from the store and they climbed into her wagon. The ride to Caleb's cabin felt endless, every minute stretching like hours. Martha tried to make conversation, but Hannah could barely respond. Her hands were clenched in her lap, her whole body tense with worry. When they finally reached the cabin, everything looked the same as Hannah remembered, except for the stillness. No smoke from the chimney despite the cool afternoon. No sounds of work or movement. Martha knocked and then entered without waiting for an answer. Hannah followed her inside and had to suppress a gasp. The cabin that had been so clean and organized when she'd left was now in disarray. Dishes sat unwashed on the table. Clothes were scattered across the floor, and in the bed in the corner, Caleb lay motionless, his face flushed with fever, his breathing harsh and labored. Hannah was at his side before she'd made a conscious decision to move. She pressed her hand to his forehead and felt the heat radiating from his skin. How long has he been like this? She asked Martha. Got worse yesterday. This morning I could barely wake him. Hannah's training from years of caring for Thomas kicked in automatically. She began issuing orders. Martha should fetch water from the well. They needed clean cloths. The fire needed to be built up to heat water for washing. Martha hurried to comply, and Hannah turned her attention to Caleb. She removed the sweat-soaked blanket covering him and began unbuttoning his shirt. He stirred slightly, his eyes fluttering open. Hannah? His voice was rough, confused. What? You shouldn't be here. Hush, Hannah said firmly. Save your strength. The cabin. It's a mess. I don't care about the cabin, Hannah interrupted. I care about you. Now be quiet and let me help you. Caleb tried to protest further, but a coughing fit overtook him, harsh and painful. Hannah supported his shoulders until it passed, then eased him back down. Over the next few hours, Hannah fell into the rhythm she remembered from nursing Thomas. Cool cloths on the forehead, forcing small sips of water, monitoring his breathing. Martha helped until evening, then reluctantly left to see to her own responsibilities, promising to return the next day. You'll stay? Martha asked at the door. I'll stay, Hannah confirmed. After Martha left, Hannah cleaned the cabin. She washed dishes and swept floors and put everything back in order, pausing every few minutes to check on Caleb, to change the cloth on his forehead, to coax more water past his lips. Night fell, and still she worked. She made broth from supplies she found in the pantry, managing to get half a cup into Caleb before he fell back into restless sleep. She bathed his face and chest with cool water, trying to bring down the fever that seemed determined to consume him. Sometime past midnight, exhausted beyond measure, Hannah finally allowed herself to rest. She pulled a chair next to the bed and sat down, her hand on Caleb's arm, monitoring his pulse, his breathing, the heat of his skin. "You're going to be all right," she whispered into the darkness. "Do you hear me, Caleb Reed? You're going to be all right because I won't allow anything else." And she meant it. She'd lost Thomas to fever, had watched helplessly as the life drained out of him despite everything she'd tried. But she wouldn't lose Caleb too. She wouldn't. The night stretched long and difficult. Caleb's fever spiked twice, sending him into delirium where he called out for Emma, for his mother, for people Hannah didn't know. She held his hand through it, spoke to him in low, steady tones, brought him back each time to the present. Dawn was breaking when his fever finally began to ease. The flush in his cheeks faded slightly. His breathing came easier. Hannah sagged in her chair with relief, tears streaming down her face. She must have dozed, because the next thing she knew, sunlight was streaming through the windows and someone was saying her name. "Hannah." She jerked awake to find Caleb's eyes open, watching her. Clear eyes now, focused and aware. "You came back," he said, his voice weak but steady. "Of course I came back," Hannah said, wiping at her face. "Did you think I wouldn't?" "I hoped," Caleb said, "but I didn't expect. You have your sister, and Luke needs—" "Luke is fine with Sarah," Hannah interrupted, "and you needed me more." Something passed across Caleb's face, surprise, gratitude, something deeper that Hannah wasn't ready to name. "I got sick," he said unnecessarily. "So I noticed." "How long?" "You've been sick for 10 days. I've been here for 1, and I'm not leaving until you're well again, so don't even try to argue." Caleb studied her face, and Hannah saw the moment he decided not to fight her on it. "All right," he said simply. "All right," Hannah echoed. She helped him sit up enough to drink some water, then insisted he try the broth she'd made. He managed a few spoonfuls before exhaustion claimed him again. Hannah eased him back down and sat watching him sleep, feeling something shift and settle in her chest. She'd come back. Not because she had to, not because there was nowhere else to go, but because when she'd heard Caleb needed help, nothing could have kept her away. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe accepting help from someone who cared wasn't weakness. Maybe it was just another form of strength. Over the next 3 days, Hannah rarely left Caleb's side. She measured his recovery in small victories. The first time he ate a full bowl of broth, the first time he sat up without her help, the first time he made it to the chair by the fireplace under his own power. Martha came by twice daily with supplies and encouragement, but it was Hannah who did the work of healing, who coaxed him to eat when he had no appetite, who changed sweat-soaked sheets in the middle of the night, who talked to him about nothing in particular just to keep him anchored to the present. On the 4th day, Sarah arrived with Luke. Hannah heard the wagon before she saw it, and her heart jumped into her throat. She'd sent word through Martha that she was staying at Caleb's to nurse him through his illness, but she hadn't expected her sister to bring Luke all this way. She met them at the door, pulling Luke into a fierce hug the moment his feet hit the ground. "Mama!" Luke wrapped his arms around her neck. "Mrs. Hollis said Caleb was sick. Is he better now?" "He's getting better," Hannah said, smoothing his hair back. "Much better." Sarah climbed down from the wagon more slowly, the baby wrapped in a blanket against her chest. She looked tired but not angry, which Hannah took as a good sign. "I thought you might need these," Sarah said, handing over a bundle. "Clean clothes for you and Luke. Some food. And I brought Luke because he wouldn't stop asking about Caleb, and I figured you'd want to see him." "Thank you," Hannah said, her throat tight. They went inside together, and Luke immediately ran to Caleb's side. The man was sitting in his chair by the fire, still weak but significantly better than he'd been even yesterday. His face lit up when he saw the boy. "Luke," Caleb said, his voice still rough but stronger. "Good to see you." "Mrs. Hollis said you were real sick," Luke said seriously. "Mama's been taking care of you?" "She has," Caleb confirmed. "Best nurse in the territory, your mother." Luke beamed with pride, and Hannah felt heat rise in her cheeks. Sarah caught her eye and smiled knowingly. While Luke chattered to Caleb about school and everything he'd been learning, Sarah helped Hannah prepare tea. They worked in comfortable silence until Sarah finally said what was clearly on her mind. "You're not coming back to Buffalo, are you?" Hannah's hands stilled on the teapot. "Sarah." "It's all right," Sarah interrupted gently. "I understand. I saw it weeks ago, really. The way you looked when he left, the way you've been these past weeks, going through the motions but not really there." "I didn't mean to." "I know," Sarah said, "and I'm not upset. A little sad, maybe, that you won't be close by. But mostly, I'm happy for you. You deserve this, Hannah. You deserve to be happy again." "I don't know if that's what this is," Hannah said carefully. "He's been sick. He needed help, that's all." Sarah gave her a look that said she wasn't fooled for a second. "When are you going to stop lying to yourself?" Before Hannah could answer, Caleb spoke from across the room. "Sarah, would you mind if I talked to your sister alone for a minute?" Sarah glanced between them, then smiled. "Of course. Come on, Luke. Let's go see if we can find some eggs for your mother." She bundled the baby back up and ushered Luke outside, leaving Hannah and Caleb alone in the cabin. Hannah busied herself with the tea, suddenly nervous. "Hannah," Caleb said quietly, "come sit down." Hannah brought 2 cups of tea over and settled into the chair across from him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Caleb said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything." Hannah's heart began to pound, but she nodded. Caleb took a breath, his gray eyes steady on hers. "When Emma died, I thought that was it for me. Thought I'd never feel anything again except the work and the exhaustion. And I was fine with that. Preferred it even. Feeling nothing was easier than feeling everything." He paused, turning his teacup between his hands. "Then you showed up on that road with your boy, barely able to stand, and something in me just woke up. I told myself I was just helping someone in need, that it didn't mean anything beyond basic human decency. But that was a lie." Hannah's breath caught, but she kept quiet, letting him speak. "Having you and Luke in my cabin these past weeks, it was the first time since Emma died that the place felt like a home, instead of just a building. You brought life back into it. Brought life back into me, if I'm being honest." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "And when you left, it felt like someone had carved out a piece of me and taken it with them." "Caleb," Hannah started, but he held up a hand. "Let me finish," he said. "I know this is fast. I know you've got every reason to be cautious. You've got Luke to think about, and a whole life to rebuild. And the last thing you need is some broken-down rancher complicating things. But I need you to know that what I said before, about the door always being open, I meant it. Not just as a place to stay if you needed it, but as something more, if you want it." Hannah felt tears spilling down her cheeks before she'd realized she was crying. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I want you to stay," Caleb said simply. "You and Luke. Not as guests, not as charity, but as family. As my family, if you'll have me." For a long moment, Hannah couldn't speak. All the walls she'd built up, all the careful defenses she'd constructed to protect her heart, they crumbled in the face of Caleb's quiet honesty. "I'm scared," she whispered finally. "I know," Caleb said. "So am I." "What if it doesn't work? What if it does?" Caleb interrupted gently. "Hannah, I can't promise you everything will be perfect. I can't promise I won't make mistakes, or that life won't be hard sometimes. But I can promise that I'll never stop trying, that I'll take care of you and Luke with everything I have, that this home will always be yours, no matter what." Hannah looked at this man who'd found her broken on a dusty road and had somehow managed to piece her back together without her even realizing it was happening. She thought about the peace she'd felt in this cabin, the safety. She thought about Luke's laughter and Caleb's patient teaching and the way it had felt to work side by side in comfortable silence. She thought about what Sarah had said, that accepting help from someone who cared wasn't weakness but strength. And she thought about what it might mean to stop running, to stop surviving, and to start actually living again. "Yes," she said, the word coming out steady and sure despite her tears. "Yes, we'll stay." The relief and joy that washed over Caleb's face took her breath away. He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, his grip warm and solid and real. "You mean it?" he asked. "I mean it," Hannah said. "If you're sure, if you really want us." "I've never been more sure of anything," Caleb said. They sat there for a moment, hands clasped, both of them crying and smiling at the same time. Then Caleb stood, still weak but determined, and pulled Hannah to her feet. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs wiping away her tears. "I'm going to kiss you now," he said, "if that's all right." Hannah laughed through her tears. "That's all right." The kiss was gentle and careful, full of promise and hope, and all the things neither of them had dared to want. When they pulled apart, Hannah rested her forehead against Caleb's chest, feeling his heartbeat steady and strong beneath her cheek. "We should tell Luke," she said softly. "We should," Caleb agreed. They went to the door together and found Sarah and Luke coming back from the chicken coop, Luke carrying a basket of eggs with great concentration. When the boy looked up and saw them standing there together, hands linked, his whole face brightened. "Are we staying, Mama?" he asked, hope shining in his eyes. Hannah looked at Caleb, who nodded encouragingly. Then she looked back at her son. "Yes, sweetheart, we're staying." Luke let out a whoop of joy and nearly dropped the eggs in his excitement. Sarah laughed and caught the basket, then came over to hug Hannah tight. "I'm happy for you," she whispered. "So happy." "Thank you," Hannah whispered back, "for everything." They stayed for another hour, making plans and sharing a simple meal. Sarah would take Luke's enrollment papers to the school in Buffalo and let them know he'd be attending the smaller school closer to Caleb's ranch instead. Hannah would collect their few belongings from Sarah's cabin over the next week. And Caleb, when he was fully recovered, would ride into town to make the arrangement official and proper, to announce his intention to marry Hannah as soon as she was ready. When Sarah finally gathered up the baby and prepared to leave, she hugged Hannah one more time. "You'll come visit?" she asked. "As often as we can," Hannah promised. Sarah climbed into her wagon and took up the reins, then paused. "You know, when you showed up on my doorstep 6 weeks ago, I was so worried about you, about how you'd manage, where you'd go. I never imagined this." She smiled. "But I should have. You always did land on your feet." After Sarah left, the three of them stood in the yard watching the wagon disappear down the road. Luke slipped his hand into Caleb's on one side and Hannah's on the other, linking them together. "Can I help you with the chores now?" Luke asked Caleb. "Like before?" "Course you can," Caleb said. "But your mama might have something to say about that, seeing as I'm supposed to be resting." "One more day of rest," Hannah said firmly. "Then you can go back to teaching Luke how to work himself to exhaustion, same as you do." Caleb smiled at her over Luke's head. "Yes, ma'am." That evening, after chores and dinner and putting an exhausted but happy Luke to bed, Hannah and Caleb sat together by the fire. Caleb was still weak enough that he tired easily, but he insisted on staying up a little longer, just to talk, just to be near her. "Tell me about Thomas," he said quietly. "If you want to." Hannah was surprised by the request, but not uncomfortable. She thought for a moment, finding the right words. "He was a good man, kind, worked hard. He loved Luke more than anything." She paused. "But he wasn't strong, not in the way you are. When things got difficult, he'd get overwhelmed, defeated. I spent a lot of our marriage holding things together on my own." "Sounds lonely," Caleb observed. "It was," Hannah admitted. "I loved him, but I was lonely, and after he died, I felt guilty for feeling relieved. Not that he was gone, I'd never wanted that, but relieved that I didn't have to pretend anymore that we were partners when really I was just carrying everything by myself." Caleb reached over and took her hand. "You won't have to do that here. Carry everything alone. We'll be partners. Real ones." Hannah squeezed his hand, believing him. "I know." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire burn down. Then Hannah said, "Tell me about Emma." Caleb smiled sadly. "She was sunshine. That's the best way I can describe her. She made everything brighter just by being in it. She saw good in everyone, believed the best about people, even when they didn't deserve it." He paused. "She would have liked you, would have appreciated how strong you are, how you keep going no matter what." I wish I could have known her," Hannah said honestly. "Me too," Caleb replied. But I think, I think she'd be glad I found you. Glad I'm not alone anymore. You were alone for a long time. Too long, Caleb agreed, but not anymore. Over the following weeks, life settled into a new rhythm. Caleb regained his strength gradually, and as he did, he taught Hannah the workings of the ranch, how to read the weather, how to manage the cattle, how to fix a fence, and when to let it wait. Luke attended the small school 3 miles down the road. Riding there on a gentle mare Caleb had decided was now the boy's responsibility to care for. And Hannah transformed the cabin from a bachelor's sparse quarters into a real home, adding touches of warmth and comfort that made the space feel lived in and loved. Martha visited regularly, delighted by the turn of events and taking full credit for bringing them together. The neighboring ranchers accepted Hannah and Luke without question, welcoming them into the loose community that looked out for each other across the vast distances of the territory. 6 weeks after Hannah had agreed to stay, Caleb rode into Buffalo and came back with a simple gold band. He proposed properly that evening, going down on one knee in front of the fireplace despite Hannah's protest that he'd already asked, and she'd already said yes. "Figured we should do it right," Caleb said, looking up at her with those clear gray eyes. "Hannah Moore, will you marry me?" Luke, watching from his pallet, called out, "Say yes, Mama." Hannah laughed through happy tears. "Yes, Caleb Reed, I'll marry you." They were married a month later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Buffalo, with Sarah and David and baby Margaret in attendance, along with Martha and half the neighboring ranches. Luke stood beside Caleb, serious and proud in new clothes, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the boy cheered louder than anyone. At the reception held at Martha's house afterward, Sarah pulled Hannah aside. "You look happy," she said simply. "I am," Hannah replied, and realized it was true. For the first time in years, maybe ever, she was genuinely, completely happy. "I'm glad," Sarah said, "and I'm glad you found him, or that he found you, however it happened." "Me too," Hannah said, watching Caleb across the room as he talked with David, Luke at his side. "I still can't quite believe it sometimes, that this is my life now." "Believe it," Sarah said, squeezing her hand. "You deserve every bit of happiness you've found." That night, riding back to the ranch in the wagon with Caleb driving and Luke already asleep between them, Hannah looked up at the stars scattered across the vast Wyoming sky. The same sky that had burned merciless and white the day she'd collapsed on the road. The same sky that had watched her struggle and survive and finally find her way home. "What are you thinking?" Caleb asked quietly, glancing over at her. "I'm thinking about that day on the road," Hannah said, "when I couldn't walk anymore and I thought that was the end, that Luke and I would die out there, and it would all have been for nothing." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Hannah, no, let me finish," she interrupted gently. "I'm thinking about how terrified I was, and how you came along and saved us, even though you had no reason to stop, no reason to care. And I'm thinking about how, if that hadn't happened, if you'd ridden past, or if we'd collapsed an hour earlier or later and missed you entirely, I wouldn't be here right now. I wouldn't have this life, this happiness. Luke wouldn't have you teaching him to be strong and capable and good." She turned to look at Caleb, this man who'd become her husband, her partner, her home. "I'm thinking that sometimes the worst moments of our lives are really just beginnings in disguise, and I'm grateful for all of it, even the hard parts that brought me here." Caleb reached over and took her hand, his grip warm and sure. "I'm grateful too," he said, "for dusty roads and stubborn women who don't know when to quit, for second chances and new beginnings, for you and Luke and this life we're building together." They rode the rest of the way in comfortable silence, the wagon rocking gently beneath them, Luke sleeping peacefully between them, and the stars bearing witness to promises kept and futures unfolding. When they reached the cabin, Caleb carried Luke inside while Hannah lit the lamps, filling the space with warm golden light. Later, after Luke was tucked into the small bed Caleb had built for him in the corner, after the fire was banked and the doors were locked, and the day was finally done, Hannah and Caleb stood together at the window looking out at the dark prairie. "Are you happy?" Caleb asked, his arm around her shoulders. Hannah leaned into him, feeling the solid strength of him, the steady beat of his heart. She thought about everything that had brought her to this moment, the loss and the struggle, the pain and the fear, The long walk through heat and dust that had ended not in death, but in life, in love, in home. "Yes," she said simply. "I'm happy." And she was. Not because life had suddenly become easy or perfect, but because she'd finally stopped running, stopped just surviving. She'd found a place to rest, a person to trust, a life worth living. She'd found a partnership built on mutual respect and genuine care, the kind of relationship she'd never quite believed existed until she'd stumbled into it, broken and desperate and completely unprepared for the grace that had met her there. The wind picked up outside, carrying with it the smell of sage and rain. Tomorrow there would be work to do, cattle to tend, fences to mend, all the daily tasks that made up a rancher's life. Tomorrow Luke would go to school and come home with stories and questions. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and joys, its own small victories and setbacks. But tonight, standing in the warm cabin with Caleb's arm around her and her son sleeping peacefully nearby, Hannah allowed herself to simply be present in this moment of perfect peace. She'd walked through fire to get here, had traveled miles that felt like lifetimes, had nearly lost everything, including herself. But she'd made it. They'd made it. And that was enough, more than enough. It was everything. The lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls of the cabin that had become a home. Outside, the Wyoming night stretched vast and dark and full of stars. And inside, in the warmth and the light and the quiet, Hannah Moore Reed rested her head against her husband's shoulder and let herself believe, finally and fully, in second chances, in new beginnings, in love that came when you least expected it and stayed when you needed it most, in the possibility that sometimes, even in the harshest heat and the deepest despair, mercy could find you on a dusty road, could lift you up, carry you home, and offer you not just survival but something far more precious, a life worth living, a love worth keeping, a future worth believing in. And that, Hannah thought, as Caleb pressed a kiss to her temple, was the greatest gift of all.